Hey everyone, welcome back to the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. I'm JP.
And I'm Peter.
We're so glad that you're with us. Today we're doing a little bit of a change up here. It's October, and well, it's the time of year that if you're someone like me, you enjoy watching a spooky movie. Peter and I want to take a look down some of the classic horror films of yesteryear, starting off with 1931 Dracula. Our hope here is that we give a critical analysis of the film and maybe give you some reasons to watch with a more discerning eye, because oftentimes, in the films from the 1930s, people might think, well, this is a little bit slow. We're kind of desensitized to a lot of the shock value that the film people of the 30s would have had. But there's a lot to unpack with this film. We think it's worth a watch, and it's very easy to watch these days. I mean, Peacock has it for free, and you could watch it on Amazon. It's a quick and easy find. So without further ado, 1931 Dracula. Shall we do it, Peter?
Dracula. Haha.
I am Dracula.
Yes, let's do it.
This film, again, was released 1931 from Universal Pictures. Now, Universal at this time was struggling. They really couldn't find their stride, and they were about to start actually a full decades long of decline here. But with the exception of this film, which turned out to be a critical success, a smash box office when it had been quite a risk, there really wasn't any sense that a full-length supernatural thriller of something of this sort would work. Well, it did. And Universal, this was turned out to be one of the very few types of films that Universal could make successfully. That and the Abbott and Costello flicks Peter and I grew up watching.
Who is on first? Well, what are you asking me for?
Love those.
Those were great.
And they had their own version of Dracula too later on, I think, right?
Well, it's not their own version. This version of Dracula. This is the first cinematic universe that was ever created, and Dracula started it all. And what happened was Universal only had two franchises that were making money. There were the Abbott and Costello films, and then there were these horror monster pictures. And so what they did is the same characters would appear, the same monster. So Bela Lugosi plays Dracula in this 1931 film, and then he plays Dracula when Dracula meets Frankenstein or the werewolf or anything like that. And so when Abbott and Costello also met Dracula and Frankenstein and all these monsters, it was the same character, Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney playing the Wolfman. It's all the same characters. It's a cinematic universe. What is the first one that actually ever did it right? So it's kind of a fun little crossover here when we're seeing Marvel and DC and all these guys. Universal did it first.
Count Dracula sleeps in this coffin, but rises every night at sunset.
Almost 100 years ago.
Exactly. So how about we go through a few plot points just so that people get a brief synopsis of the film, and then maybe we go into what was good and what was maybe not so good about this film. Great. So this film is pretty closely based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, the film from the 1800s. It's the Romantic era piece. Really, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula are the two books that probably influenced this genre to the more than any other at this point. They always refer back to those two pieces when you're making a supernatural horror, and so even though the credits give credit to a play which I've not read. But I have read Bram Stoker's Dracula, and you can really see that it's very closely. They should have said Bram Stoker's Dracula when they were writing this, when they were writing the credits and what it's based off of. One point we can review the play itself, but this is very closely aligned to that book. And so you see all the characters and all the plot points are really quite closely matched. It starts off where we're in Transylvania, riding through a stagecoach where there's howling wolves on every side, and there's a young Englishman who is on a trip for business to go help Dracula purchase a mansion back in England. And this Englishman has no idea who Count Dracula is, although the poor townsfolk that are driving on the stagecoach really try to warn him. And so he takes no heed of it and helps Dracula get to England. And then Dracula starts doing all sorts of havoc while he's there, including he seems to have a propensity for wanting to feed upon beautiful young ladies, sucking their blood, of course, when I say feeding. And once Dracula does that, really one or two things could happen. He could kill you, or he could turn you into a vampire. More often than not, it's the latter. And so then we have at least one young lady wandering the countryside as a vampire. The book calls her the Bloofer Lady, which I think is a great name that we need to refer back to. You'll see that name pop up with the Netflix's vampire, the Dracula saga. I think it was a mini series of 3 or 4. It's not very good, not worth watching. It's one of those trashy things that we mentioned here at the beginning. So I would avoid that one. But if you want a good Dracula fix, the 1931 film I would highly recommend that a little bit better. So he's going wrecking about all sorts of havoc until one man is able to say, oh, hang on, this is something that's going on, that this is because no one believed that there was a vampire. They're like, oh, those are old myths, old legends. Until one guy said, no, these myths and legends are something that's worthwhile paying attention to. And that's, of course, Dr. Van Helsing. And Van Helsing is the only person who, first of all, believes that there is such thing as a vampire that should be stopped, and then goes about stopping him. Mm-hmm. And we won't give away the ending, at least here. Maybe we can refer to some of the endings when are good or bad points, but it sets up the battle between Van Helsing and Dracula quite nicely. It's a short film. It's a very simple film. It ends in about 75-minute runtime. So they don't spend too much time getting into intricate plot points and details, which is something all of these Universal monster flicks go on to do. I think it's very effective, although if you're looking for a 3-hour-long Lord of the Rings saga with a lot of intricate little character developments, this is not the place for it. So in any case, Peter, did I miss anything with the synopsis?
No, I mean, I think that's a basic thing. I'm not super familiar with the book. I haven't read that one. I have read Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was, really quite moving, quite crazy.
I'm reading that now. Don't give it away.
Yeah, that one's that's a hard hitting book. But I'm not as familiar with Dracula. So I did think that it was kind of cool that I just know like the stereotypical, like idea of Count Dracula that we have, being kind of like a cartoonish kind of scary man. So it was kind of cool to see this, I guess, one of the first depictions of Dracula on film. It was kind of cool to see him a little bit more fleshed out, as opposed to just being like a cartoon kind of Abbott and Costello figure. So I really enjoyed the film. I think I watched it, though, I will say, probably in the prime time to watch it, in the best time to watch it. I watched it in the middle of the night. And I was like all alone, and it was very dark and, very lonely and forlorn outside when I watched it. So I felt like that was the prime conditions to watch this movie. So I might have been
dark and stormy night.
Yes, I might have had an unfair proclivity to liking it, given the conditions that I watched it. But I thought it was really good.
Nice. Okay. Well, let's see. Let's take a more critical eye here. What are one of the things that stood out to you that this film did really well?
Well, something I liked was just that to get a little bit of they had little Easter eggs here and there of like Dracula's backstory. They said that he had been living for thousands of years, and basically he was a ally of the devil, is what I got out of it. And he hated, he was evil and he hated goodness. He would always, run from the crucifix and anything that was, good. But he also did really, like, there was a couple of comments that he made here and there where he was like, how good it must be to actually be dead, because I don't think
it's
ever really,
much worse than dying.
Yes. And that's his fate, right? With that he is living in a castle on his own for thousands of years. I guess he has those wives, which I'm very curious to know more about what their story is. But yeah, it was really interesting because I never really realized that he was, I guess, a person who had been living for thousands of years, cursed in some way, I'm guessing. And where he's dead, he's kind of like a zombie, he's like, I guess the early version of a zombie where he is actually dead. He's an undead person, living in he sleeps in a coffin. He has to be buried in Transylvanian dirt, which was an interesting little point there. So I just thought that was cool that I got a little bit more of a window into the OG Dracula. And of course, that point too, which is something I really appreciated, and I think you could probably appreciate too as Catholic, was actually that respect for the crucifix, that he couldn't resist it. He would always run away from it whenever he saw it. He'd be like, hiss, and he'd run away or cover his face. From my understanding of spiritual, kind of the spiritual world and demonic activity, is that they really do hate the crucifix.
Yeah.
And they really cannot stand the sight of it. Like if you hold it to them anywhere near them, they will hiss, and it burns them and it hurts. And that's real. That's a real reaction from demonic activity, exposed to something as holy and wonderful as the crucifix.
Yeah.
And you don't really see that nearly as much, that same respect in modern horror films,
right?
I think, because my understanding, the way I see it, I think that a lot of modern horror filmmakers kind of look at it. They don't see the crucifix as something to be respected. They see it as this is kind of a stick, like a horror stick that's been used, and that everyone expects it to be powerful. So we're going to be, cool and make it not powerful, which is just really doing a disservice to the genre, in my opinion. So I loved that respect that it had.
I absolutely. You said so many things that resonated with me. I'll just pick up on the last point because you said so many, but just to pick up on the last one. What you see oftentimes in horror films these days, which this film does not do, but you see it in maybe not just straight up horror, but pretty much anything that has to do with the supernatural, is there's a gamification of the supernatural, where I didn't invent that term. That's a term that others have invented and thrown out, but where it's the crucifix has a certain amount of hit points, but the bad guy has more hit points. And so the bad guy can overcome the crucifix because, the bad guy is he's just too bad. He's got more hit points. So Stranger Things does that. You even see something of that when, I love Lord of the Rings, the Peter Jackson's trilogy. But Tolkien in his book, he spoke about, and this is getting ahead of myself a little bit, but Tolkien spoke about how the voice of Sauron was the power of Sauron. And Peter Jackson's film, the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf and Sauron, they're fighting as if it's almost like a gamification where, okay, who has more hit points? And they're just throwing each other around with their staff. When that's not the deeper reality that Tolkien is speaking to. It's very similar to what happens in Stranger Things, where Elle is throwing around whoever the big bad guy is in the latest season. I don't really know. And then he's throwing her around, and who has more hit points to last longer. And you can see that kind of that sort of idea in later Dracula versions where okay, for example, Van Helsing in that terrible Van Helsing film with Hugh Jackman. The boy and I were watching a few scenes from that. We just had to laugh because it's so bad. But Van Helsing is super strong, but then he gets super more strong, in the Hugh Jackman version, and he has to rip off his shirt, and that's how he's able to overcome Dracula.
It's the Hugh Jackman abs that just really brings that extra power in.
Exactly. But that's not the case here. What we see here is really the symbolism of the piece of this deeper reality is what is at play. It's you tear back I try and speak to it in The Extrovert, where you tear apart the thin fabric of what we can see, our own little normal reality, and then you see into a supernatural reality. And that's what something like the crucifix speaks to, was when Dracula sees that, he just cannot stand the sight of it. And it doesn't matter how powerful Dracula is and how weak whoever it is that has it. For example, Jonathan Harker, which we can get to that character later on. That's actually one of the points I want to make about something I don't like about this film. But Jonathan Harker is very weak in this, and he just so happens to have a crucifix, and that keeps evil at bay. You know, it's like, oh my gosh, you know. And then the same thing happens with Renfield, which is another character that I want to come back to later on. But he just so happens to have a crucifix, and that keeps evil at bay. So it's not just the fact that there's some strong person who knows what the crucifix does, that it's actually that the crucifix symbolizes something that's stronger than the evil. You know, there's a reality beyond here that this signifies, and this is a carryover from what Bram Stoker was speaking about in his great novel. Nowadays, okay, the idea for Bram Stoker's Dracula came from a nightmare, just like a lot of good horror films come from nightmares. For example, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein also came from a nightmare. So Bram Stoker was you know in the clutches of a nightmare, and he's dreaming that he's out. I think he's walking, and there's this some like demonic woman that comes out and grabs him and starts to try to bite him. And then an even more demonic man comes out, and he like, drives the woman away. And the demonic man says, "No, this one is mine." And then Jonathan wakes up. Oh, not Jonathan. That's the character. Bram Stoker actually wrote that scene in, and Jonathan is the character who experiences that scene in the novel. But then Bram wakes up in real life, you know, this, and that's the impetus that pushes him to write this novel. And so very clearly, Bram is thinking of Dracula as the devil. And in later years, people have been trying to say, no, this is some sort of homosexual sort of storyline that he's trying to inject into his you know, his day-to-day, and so he's making the homosexuality as Dracula. But it's complete misunderstanding of the time that Bram Stoker is living in. He's living in 1800s, in the mid 1800s in England, when England is as Protestant as they come. It's just strong Christian through and through. So homosexuality is not a storyline that would be, especially someone like Bram, who's deeply religious. What he's talking about, and it keeps on, and you referred to it with the crucifix, and you see this, it's carried on inside this 1931 film. He's speaking about the symbolism that's been lost to English Protestantism, the symbolism that exists in this world and shows a foretaste or some sort of glimpse beyond what we can see. And the English Protestantism doesn't have that same idea to it as Catholics do. So I would posit here that Bram Stoker is writing as, you know, he's lost his Catholic sensibilities, or he perceives that England has lost its Catholic sensibilities, and he's writing about what has been lost, saying there's a danger here. There is real evil. The devil is out there. How are we going to face this real evil without these tools that we've had? And so what we see in this film is that carryover of symbolism being real, like having a real effect in our world. Like it speaks to a deeper reality. I'll keep on hitting on that. So it's just a complete ode to symbolism. And that's really the heart of what Bram is writing about. And you see that very much in this film.
Yeah. I mean, that's crazy. I didn't know that the story came from a nightmare. That's wild to me, because I mean, I think that it's really true what you're saying, that this speaks to a deeper reality, because as we can like have the cartoony like spooky season, but you know, this is real. Like the demons are real, and spiritual world is real, and this is this actual battle, actual warfare that's being fought. And I think that that's why, like, people, when you kind of have this modern relativist kind of idea that like you know, we all try to be good and virtuous and all religions are basically the same, that's, you know, putting aside everything else, just thinking of it on the factor of like which one equips you the best to be able to face true and real evil. And I think that's definitely Catholicism, which even this Dracula 1931 film kind of speaks to, and from the sound of it, the book as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's just from also just a perspective of the Eucharist, that what other religion has the ability for God and man to be completely and wholly united through the Eucharist, and that I know is something that demons are just terrified of.
Right.
And so that just thinking of it from that perspective is something that I think as Catholics we can take great joy and gratitude from, and something to also just realize that because this spiritual reality is very real.
Yeah.
And that is something that we can ignore for a certain extent or try to explain away, but it's something that's very real and something that has to be faced and contended with.
Absolutely, it does. Absolutely. And speaking of facing and contending with evil, I want to bring up one of my favorite scenes, just to dissect one moment of the scene. And I already hinted upon why I like this scene, but the scene between Van Helsing and Dracula, where they're face to face, like all the masks have come off. Like Van Helsing has revealed he knows who Dracula is, and Dracula has stopped his pretense of like he can say, yes, I'm a nobleman from Transylvania. He's dropped that, and he's like, I am evil, and you know I'm evil, so I'm going to kill you now, and I'm not making no pretense about it. And so when there's that great moment there when they face each other, it's a wizard's duel. It's more like a wizard's duel that Tolkien was writing about than what Peter Jackson made in the Fellowship of the Ring. And I feel like I'm speaking about this great trilogy that Peter Jackson made in a pejorative sense, but I don't mean to. I love that trilogy. It's one of my favorite films of all time, those three. I'm just pointing out one weakness that this film gets really right, which shows how much I appreciate this film. The wizard's duel between Van Helsing and Dracula is completely based upon the power of Dracula's words, and if Van Helsing can withstand that power of his words. And it's a fascinating scene which shows how the two kind of go at it each other. And I've imagined making scenes similar to that, specifically when it comes to Lord of the Rings, where Finrod Felagund is facing down the Dark Lord Morgoth in the Silmarillion, which we've talked about. I would love to make a series of the Silmarillion. Those two, they do have weapons, but their weapons are fought more with words, and their words signify how the weapons act, how the weapons interact. And so it's really a wizard's duel between this elf and this Dark Lord. And you see this here, this wizard's duel between this good doctor, and this Dark Lord, Dracula, who stands for the devil. So it's a brilliant scene, and there's a couple of things that I want to point out about the scene. When I first saw Van Helsing in the film, he's the only character that is wearing glasses that I could remember, that I could point out. And there's a recurring shot when it comes to Dracula, or anyone who's in Dracula's sway, is Dracula's eyes. The filmmakers are really careful. They just light up Dracula's eyes, and they play up Bela Lugosi's. His face is incredibly expressive, and his eyes, he's going like, something like that. He's just it. I don't think there are actors around who could pull off what Bela did with his eyes, and the filmmakers took full advantage of that by obscuring everything except the eyes, so everything's in shadow, and they just have this thin light. And when the power of his eyes is generally enough to send whoever it is that he's facing into complete submission. He's able to take control of the situation with his eyes. But Van Helsing is interesting. He's got these glasses, and oftentimes the glasses will reflect the light. It's like the glasses catch the light, and it speaks to a very deep symbolism of the moment, because he turns and his eyes are occluded almost by this light. It's his shield, so to speak, as this wizard's duel is happening. So he already has a sort of supernatural help. His eyes are aided, so it's not the power of his own eyes, but it's these kind of supernatural shields that you have. And it's this great moment that happens between the two, which of course the trump card is the crucifix. When everything goes bad, and Dracula makes his last desperate gambit, the ultimate aid of Van Helsing is the crucifix. So it's a great end to the scene. And it's a very iconic shot. That shot where there's that reveal of the crucifix is one that they play, you know, whenever there's a moment where you refer back to that scene, you know, it's the reveal of the crucifix and then the reaction of this dark lord. It becomes really a part of cinema lore. So that just for that scene alone, this film is worth the watch.
Yeah, and that seems really, that it was quite striking to me. That one definitely stood out to me as well, because it has obvious like limitations, you know, unlike, you know, things of today where there's tons of ability to have all this CGI and like big huge battle scene. This is, you know, one of the main big climaxes of the movie and a big battle scene. But there's obviously no CGI in there. I don't think there's even any practical effects either. It's just purely the two actors really going at it. And you have the drama of Dracula, you know, reaching out his hands and saying, "Come to me," or something like that. And then he even talks to him kind of like a Darth Vader, like, "Wow, you are like, you know, impressive, most impressive." And then like kind of, you know, I guess maybe they kind of trying to infect him with the pride of like, "Oh, I'm actually pretty strong." And then, you know, what's his name? Van Helsing starts like, the drama really plays out quite well, because I was at the edge of my seat, because he starts moving towards him. I'm like, no, not the one guy he's smart enough to do something. And he's like starting to move towards him, but then he stops, then he pulls back, and then he like starts moving towards him again. So I just thought, yeah, they did a really good job, especially for something that was made like, let's just think about that for a second. Also, 1931, that's nearly 100 years ago. So yeah, I think that it was a really incredible scene, especially thinking of it being almost 100 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great scene. And you're right. It's very minimal. Like I remember noting there's almost no music to this film. And yet and there's no music in that moment. And if you were to make this film now, there's no way you would leave that moment bare of any music. You would have climactic music, but it still plays despite the fact that it's almost completely bare throughout. And the sound design is we're not used to this bare minimalist sound design now. We would layer so many sound effects on top of sound effects, you know, like, you know, so we're like, you know, that's all that type of stuff.
That was good. Very good.
So it doesn't have any of that, and it still works amazingly well. I know we're trying to do a speed round here, so I want to mention at least one more thing and give you a chance to mention one more good thing, and then we move to some of the more critical analysis of this film. The scene, the climactic scene, it is so clever. I remember just going when I saw it, I thought, that's it. They figured it out. This is the deeper moment that pretty much all films these days cannot manage they cannot reach that level, that higher level of a deeper thought and deep symbolism. The last scene is played out in the upside down. You know, remember how Stranger Things has the upside down? Well, this is the original upside down. So Dracula has chosen as a lair underneath a church, underneath an abbey. And so he's in the opposite of a church in his lair. And so when you go down into his lair for the final confrontation, you have the filmmakers made these huge set pieces with deep dark pillars, but the pillars extend down. And so instead of pointing up to the earth, to the skies, to the heavens like churches do, which is what a church is built to do, is to point to God, to heaven, it points down into hell, basically. So they're fighting this battle in hell, where the upside down of the church is what it symbolizes, you know. So instead of having a deep CGI and all, you know, all this crazy battle scenes or George Lucas throwing fire everywhere, this is just a simple moment of reality, where like, where would the devil fight in his ultimate, you know, he would create hell on earth, and that's where he would fight. He would turn tail, and it's like Morgoth fighting on the Iron Mountain, you know, or on the Mountain of Fire, Mount Doom. This is the last point where he could, where he will make his stand, and that is where the Van Helsing and Jonathan face Dracula. And then of course there's that great scene too, where when it's all completed, I won't say what characters survive, but there is characters that go back up the steps. There's these great steps, and they're going back up the steps to heaven, basically. They're ascending out of hell. It's a very Dantean sort of picture, which I have to imagine these filmmakers knew what they were doing. That's why they made it that way. They departed very much from the book for that final scene. And most of the time when they depart from the books, it doesn't work in this film. But for this scene, it works. It's brilliant. It works so well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the descending and ascending definitely really stuck out to me, because that is a very dramatic, huge. I think that was probably one of the biggest set pieces that they had there. This huge staircase kind of spiraling down, and then, yeah, I guess we don't want to give away too much, but when like the person is like falling down the stairs, that was like very dramatic as well. And they kind of just like, you know, collapse and I guess fall into they fall down, they're like rolling down the stairs, and then they fall into this, like down the stairs off the side of it. That's very, like, thinking of that bottom as hell, like very symbolic, like that really like stands out to me in a big way now. Thinking of that as their soul, you know, their soul descending into hell now, because they live their life, you know, choosing to serve the devil, because that character the entire time is referring to this devil character as master. And so in the end, they descend, that their body and soul is descending into hell. But that inversion note is quite dramatic. It's really true, and it really brings up to me this idea of how even today the devil, like, it doesn't create and doesn't build. He only twists and inverts what is good. And so you take a beautiful church which uplifts you and takes the best of earth and of our ability to build and create, and inverts it into something dark and twisted and morbid. And so I think they did a great job really at pointing it out, and even that I didn't even realize all that too much either when I was watching it, but you really get, even without realizing it, you definitely get a sense of the gravity that the film kind of creates. Even for me, like from the very beginning of it, with the dramatic music and like the even the intro sequence with the titles, that was, it really set the tone very well. For me, kind of that recurring thing that I appreciated was definitely their very effective use, I thought, of the black and white imagery, like you were saying, where they would light up his eyes, or the people under his influence's eyes would be all lit up, and they'd be very, you know, glowing and sparkling. Very, like, whenever even the girl, when she was under his influence, her fiance could tell like something was wrong with her, and he was like, "Your eyes, like what's the matter with you? What's going on?" So I just really loved that use of the cinematography in it. I think was really quite effective.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. So transitioning a little bit into some of the things that I don't think were nearly as brilliant. The characters, they're weaker. A lot of these characters, with the exception of Van Helsing, who is full fleshed out, is a good character. And I think it was because of time. I'm guessing the scriptwriters and the director were like, okay, we want to cut this down as much as possible. And so they threw out a lot of the character development that was present in the books. And I think even despite the fact that 75 minutes is short, I think they threw out more than they had to in the interest of simplifying. So the two of the most egregious points are really Lucy and Mina. The book, when I read it, I was most struck by the dimensionality of the female characters. Oftentimes books of this time and I think they're, if Bram Stoker's Dracula is any indication, they're unjustly characterized as having weak female characters. That's what the books of this time are shown. Well, this movie definitely has that. It's the Mina and Lucy. Well, they're ditzy at best. That's about the nicest thing you could say about them. In the books, I find Lucy really an interesting character. Like if I was going to make this story, I would dive into Lucy and Mina and the storylines of the two. Is in particular, Lucy, I think, is not very developed in most films these days. She's kind of just shown as the person who just dies, and they don't talk anymore about her. But Lucy is really in the book shown as kind of an angel of light who's twisted in a very Luciferian way. And her storyline is incredibly tragic. Bram Stoker twists the knife when it comes to this character who he really seems to like. And her fate is pretty terrible. It's pretty gruesome. And I think that is room for storytelling to really expand if you focus on that. And then Mina is just a fascinating character. She carries the piece with a few exceptions that really, I think, weaken the overall book. And so when you compare that book, the kind of the intricacies of these two characters, and then you see two ditzy female characters, it really is kind of a letdown. They could have done more with that. But you see that quite a lot also. Like Jonathan Harker, he's a hero in this book, just like Mina is a hero. And in this one, he's more of a villain more than anything. And I don't see any reason for that. I mean, he kind of turns there at the end, but it's sort of a last minute sort of thing. And it doesn't feel very earned in my mind that Jonathan were to do that. So they really do him no justice. But I think the worst, the two, I guess, tied for worst. One is Dr. Seward. Dr. Seward is a fascinating character who represents science to this degree and how science and faith interact with each other. And he's just an old man in this one. In the book, he's a young, vibrant man who is in love with Lucy. Instead, he's like Mina's dad in this, and I think it's really just kind of a weak sort of play to like, okay, shoehorn why Dr. Seward is there, because we got to have a Dr. Seward there, and he has to like care for Mina in some way, and so that's why we're gonna make him Mina's dad, and it really doesn't work. But I think the saddest one, I guess, if I was going to have to vote, is probably what they do to Renfield's character. Renfield, I think, is the prototype for Smeagol. I see a lot. I think Tolkien read this book, and Smeagol, him and Renfield, they have a very similar arc, and it's a fascinating, tragic tale. And instead, in this book, he becomes kind of a simpering weakling. He has a couple of moments where you can see he's trying to fight, but he has no way of actually fighting. And he also takes, for some reason, huge chunks out of Jonathan's storyline, where Jonathan is trying to be a hero in the book, and all of a sudden they inject and they put Renfield into the character into that moment, and it doesn't really make much sense. So I think the character development is really where it falls down. I have a couple other things, but I wanted to pause here. Any other thoughts for you about what doesn't work in this film?
I mean, for me, you really kind of viewing it as a modern viewer, you really definitely see the limitations, right, of what they're able to do and not do, and that kind of it for someone who's very used to the more modern films, it might be a little bit difficult to watch in some ways, because you're wanting that more fast pace or that sharp kind of very quick dialogue. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing in my mind. But of course, like, I'm not quite as familiar with the book, definitely not as familiar with the book as you are. But I would definitely agree when you say that the two girls, but to me, it's not necessarily the two girls, but it's more like the younger characters. The young people are much more not really as three-dimensional characters. They're kind of just people who run around, being all emotional and acting emotionally, including like Harker, the dude, the fiance, and Mina. They're both very just driven by, like, I guess, whims, and again, I think that, to me, I kind of see that as like of the limitations of what what the filmmakers saw, because I mean this is very early film, you know, and so
That's very
I can't
early
imagine.
talking. Yeah.
Right. I can't imagine that they really had the perspective that we do today of being like, you can actually spend time developing these characters in this amount of time in the film that you have. I imagine like they don't have that context of film that we do have today. And so to me, that's kind of like a limitation that they had, just not realizing that the fullness of what this medium is able to do in exploring like these characters in this book. Because today when we like write, like when we make a film, we realize like this is a very has the potential to tell a full three-dimensional story with all the three-dimensional characters. But I really doubt that, like, you know, when you look at other films that were coming out at the time, they're basically cartoons acted out by live actors. So I think it was extremely cutting edge and very quite incredible for, especially given its time. But again, like it's working with limitations of how they saw film and what they were able to do at that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it would behoove us to say many people, especially people used to watching modern films, are not going to enjoy this film. You're right. Like, for example, my wife didn't really enjoy watching this. I did. I thought it was a good film, but I am used to watching old movies. I think if you're not used to watching old movies, this might be difficult, but I think it is worth, I mean, I would challenge someone who might be watching. Old movies have something to say, you know, that there is a lot of good here. And I think you can, you know, whatever you consume, it changes little bits of you. And so this little film, if you were to watch it, I think it would change whatever little bits it changes. I think it would change it for the better. So that's a good thing. A couple of things that I think I just want to real quickly also state about this film that I don't think works. One, there's the costumes that sometimes are wonderful, they're spectacular, and then other times it seems strangely dated. Like I couldn't really place what the time period is that they're trying to do. They're trying to say the time period is, because, you know, at times it feels old and like in the 1800s when Brahm was writing, and then other times it feels like they're flappers, you know, they're dressed like flappers, and it just seems odd at odds with each other. So I want to like the costumes, but then I don't like it when they look like flappers. I'm not really, I don't like that at all. And the last thing I would say is a very interesting little bit. One of the characters, Martin, who's the attendant of the insane asylum where Renfield is housed, he's supposed to operate, in my sense, he's supposed to operate as a Shakespearean sort of chorus, whereas the comic relief / chorus that steps in and says, this is what's happening. It's kind of a meta moment where he speaks to the story as it's unfolding. This is a Shakespearean tool that he kind of, as later Shakespeare, he starts to play with the play within the play through the chorus, which is really interesting. And I think that's what Martin, the character, is supposed to operate as, and it just doesn't ever seem to fit. It's like a chorus, but the chorus is singing out of tune. And so it's like he's supposed to be comic relief, but he's not funny. And then he's supposed to be commenting on the story as it's happening, but it's not really commenting. So I think that's a little bit of an element that it didn't work, but it very much interests me because I like the idea of choruses now. Like, I think that's an element of storytelling that is useful to bring back, because I think modern audiences could find it useful again. Maybe not in the part maybe as a frame for the story, more as interweaving, instead of interweaving the story as the chorus in Shakespearean plays worked, but almost a frame for it. It's a story, kind of something I'm developing in my own work. But in any case, well, why don't we put a pause there, unless there are other things that or other critical points that you want to make about Dracula.
I mean, I definitely, the Martin character, he stood out to me a little bit too, because they definitely had moments of focusing on him, you know. So again, coming as someone who's not very familiar with the book and what his character is supposed to represent, he definitely was kind of like a little bit of comic relief, which I liked. You know, I liked it. Okay. I thought he was funny every once in a while. But there were a couple of awkward moments too. I think especially there was one moment where he was talking to like the maid or someone like that. Yeah. And he was like, they're all crazy and I'm not so sure about you either. And I was like, wait, what?
And she like backs away kind of awkwardly. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, what does that mean? Or like, what's going on right now? So I can kind of see what you're saying there. Like, it's kind of like a commentary, but it's also a commentary on something completely unrelated that is not on anyone's mind. So we're all kind of left wondering like, wait, what are we talking about right now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can see where you're coming from a little bit there on that kind of awkwardness.
Nice. Okay. Well, putting a pause there, like let's transition a little bit. So the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, we're Catholic filmmaking brothers working to revitalize the world of Catholic art. We hope you enjoyed this little commentary on Dracula. And if so, please, if you take a list, watch the film, give it a shot. Tell us what you think about it. If you feel so motivated to, I think we'd like to hear what you think. But speaking of what people think, Peter, I wanted to bring up one of our comments we had on our last podcast. We had a request to speak about indulgences, which or speak more about it. And I know we've talked about it some, but I think the request was to make the entire podcast about indulgences, which seems like quite the challenge. But what do you make of that?
I mean, that would be pretty cool. Yeah, that'd be awesome. The indulgences, obviously a huge controversy, very major part in leading to the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation. And so, I think that you could definitely spend a whole podcast talking about that. Maybe even within the context of the spooky season.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Connection there?
Absolutely. I mean, because the indulgences, the idea of indulgences comes from the church's response to people fearing hell, fearing punishment for what they know to be their own shortcomings and sins. The indulgences kind of came out of a extremely spiritual reality conscious world. Medieval world was very aware of death. It was something ever present to them. And so what comes after death was always something that was much more present to people's minds than it is today. And so that's why indulgences was such a huge thing in the church at that time, because people were looking for any way possible to be able to earn or to win some kind of guarantee or some kind of hope for salvation. And so we can talk a long time, about how it was abused and how things were taken in the wrong way. But also, like, we can talk about how a lot of it did come from an honest desire for salvation from the part of people who were much wiser in many ways than people today.
Okay, well, fascinating. It sounds like a date then. Let's put something together, shall we?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. One more odd and end to bring up before we close here. It would behoove us also to speak about to mention the fact that yesterday, hopefully we'll be posting this very soon, but yesterday was Columbus Day, and this has become a very controversial holiday, right?
Yep. I mean, I've become quite used to seeing the posts or signs even of Columbus being labeled as a perpetuator or a pusher of genocide and a mass murderer and a rapist and a killer of babies. And I'm like, what are we talking about now? I think, to me, a lot of this comes from a hatred of the West and the hatred of Christianity and Christianity's influence on the Americas and the Western Hemisphere. It's really, it does us no justice, because we are left with no identity, no idea of who we are and how we've come here. I was just talking to a coworker of mine the other day about how our society and our people. She was bringing up how we think of ourselves as smarter than people who have come before us, and that's not true. because we are a society and a people who have built on the shoulders of giants. We only have what we have today. We only have iPhones and internet and all of this, satellites and all this technology and knowledge because of the people who came before us, who did not have any of that to build on. So we build on the foundations and the bulwarks of what people before us did. And one of those people is Columbus, and he is one of the giants of who created in many ways the world that we live in today. And so trying to write him off as a murderer and a simple cartoon villain is completely idiotic, in my opinion, because it's rejecting, it's having the arrogance to say everything that's good came from us right now. And that's not true. We could not exist as we do today without people like Columbus, who had the bravery to do something that had never been done before, never been thought of before, to build something greater than most people today could ever imagine of building.
Absolutely. Your argument is so strong. I would love to, and I don't want to spend too much time because I know that we want to close here, but how do we let's create an Iron Man here. What's the argument that someone has against Columbus now?
Well, I mean, there's different angles and approaches that I think people have issues with Columbus. Most people will take the approach that he killed a lot. He killed and enslaved the Native Americans that he encountered, and that I've heard multiple people repeat this line from a historical account of Columbus and his men throwing native babies down the cliffs just because they thought it was funny or fun, down the cliffs just to watch them hit the ground and die. And they say, what kind of horrific, evil man would do this? Those accounts are written based off of the accounts of his political rival and enemy. So basically that's like taking what CNN says about any Trump or any conservative and saying like, this person is evil and hates, kills women, kills babies, and kills, the innocent. And then just taking that at face value and saying, okay, yeah, this is what that person did. So like all accounts that we have of Columbus doing those things is like things that you probably don't want to take at face value. And so, but I think that this really going back to what I was saying a second ago is that the desire to discredit and to hate Columbus, just really, it does come from a hatred of what he built and what we have as Americans today,
right?
Our Western Christian culture and society.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the heart of it right there. Like you said, I think it's a simple no suffices. I think the point that we hold on to here is that the West is not perfect, but the West is good. We've created a culture that's managed to, the West ended slavery, and in the West it's been ended, and we're trying to stamp it out everywhere. This underground slave trade, that used to be a legalized thing all over the world. Not just in the West, but in Africa and Asia and everywhere. This was a part of mankind, and yet it's different now. So we have created a civilization, a culture that is predicated upon the idea that all men are something to be valued. That's not trivial. That's something that's precious. And sure, we don't follow that mantra very well. We have abortion, for example, which is exact opposition to that idea. But the fact that we as a people try to follow that, and we fail from time to time, but we follow it, shows that there has been good in our ancestors. You don't arrive at a good end if you didn't aim to get to that good end. It takes motivation. There's not a randomness in that way. So we have much to be grateful for. Someone like Columbus, maybe he's not perfect, but he did something I couldn't do. And he did something that all of the people that are trying to tear down the West and use Columbus as a way to tear down the West could never do. So no, you can come to me with your primary sources, and I'll come to you with better primary sources. Those people that you spoke, or that one source that you spoke to, well, you know what? Queen Isabel also believed that one source, and she imprisoned Columbus because she valued human life. However, unlike these leftists that we have now, she actually looked into the matter and found that those sources were without merit. And she apologized to Columbus for that and restored him to the honor that he deserved. So this was something that was tried in court. And up until very recently, he's been exonerated from this charge. And so it's a very convenient thing that now, when people are trying to tear down the West and tear down, this thing that's so fragile that we've inherited, they're trying to use that old charge that has no merit. There's no accident there. So, Viva Columbus. Way to go, you little Italian admiral that had big dreams. Way to go. He did great.
Didn't take no for an answer. Yep.
Yeah.
Kept on trying. Eventually made it to the Americas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we went far longer than I anticipated. I apologize in advance, but I hope you all enjoyed. Any other last thoughts, Peter?
Well, I'm excited to kind of continue on this theme of spooky season, and also maybe talk about indulgences at some point. But I do love how it kind of all our topics kind of tied in together at the end, of how the evil and the devil kind of doesn't create things new. He just twists things, twists the truth, twists goodness. And that's what people, I think, oftentimes are doing now with the West and with Columbus, twisting the truth and twisting what is good to destroy what we have built and what is good in this world. And like you said, the answer to that is no. No, we're not willing to forget our identity and to forget the truth. We are intent on preserving and to continue building on what our forefathers have given us, and to continue striving for God and for goodness.
Amen. All right, we'll leave it there. Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you all next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Pinedo Brothers Podcast, an artist podcast for Catholics. We hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please consider subscribing, and commenting below. That really helps. This episode was edited and recorded by me, JP. Makeup was done by no one, if you couldn't tell. For more information on us, check us out at pinedobrothers.com. Thanks again.